So, ladies and gentlemen, it is a genuine Q&A, and so as you know, I expect Tony Jones knows who he's asking questions. I don't. So, in the ordinary way, we've got a roving microphone. We'll start with Richard Grant. Got a microphone for you, Richard.
There's a microphone.
Dick Grant, I live in Robe. The question I want to ask you concerns the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. How, and the sum of money of $30 million, or $42 million, which has been sent out over there. How do you ensure that this is appropriately used? In my experience, and I've had some experience in East Africa, is there's a hell of a lot of corruption which occurs when we're not able to manage our own donations and assistance which we give.
Dick, that is a very good question. This is an example of an event thousands of kilometres away from Australia, yet if it's not handled or managed properly, it could impact on our region. Ebola was first discovered in 1976, so there have been outbreaks before. But here we are almost 40 years on, and this particular outbreak has been devastating. Almost 7,000 people have died, including 365 health professionals. And so it is in 3 countries at present, mainly because of the poor health systems of those countries, wrapped by conflict, wrapped by corruption. And were it not for the efforts of the United States in Liberia, France in Guinea, and the United Kingdom, Australia and Canada in Sierra Leone, this could have turned into a global pandemic. And quite frankly, if you got Ebola into PNG or the Pacific Islands, it would have been a tragedy beyond imagination. So we were very careful when we were asked to respond. The Labor Party were very critical of us, saying we've got to send volunteers, we've got to go in there, we've got to go in guns blazing. No, we were very measured and careful about it because we wanted to make sure whatever taxpayer money we used was actually making a difference to prevent the disease spreading and prevent it coming to our region. So what we did is work with the United Kingdom, who had agreed to build hospitals in Sierra Leone. As a former colony of Britain, they kind of took responsibility for Sierra Leone. They would build hospitals and staff them with British and other nationals so that they were in control of the building and the staffing and the managing of these hospitals. And they asked Australia to take one of these hospitals. They were building 5 100-bed hospitals. We did some very detailed negotiating and agreed to take responsibility for one of the 100-bed hospitals. We didn't send our Defence Force, as Britain did, because our Defence Force is not equipped to carry out this kind of humanitarian work. It does other humanitarian work, but not this sort. So we contracted a company called Aspen Medical. It happens to be an Australian company that specialises in this kind of response to disease outbreaks and the like. And we worked with Aspen Medical before in 2004 with the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, and they're very good. So we contracted Aspen Medical to staff and manage the hospital that the Brits built. So the Brits built it, and we are paying for the staffing and managing of it. So there is no, we're not going through the Sierra Leone government, we're not going through any of these middle people, we're doing it directly. The cost of the hospital and the staffing and everything, you know, getting rid of the waste, management, the catering, everything, is actually costing us about $30 million. The additional money has gone to Red Cross, gone to the World Health Organization, and $2 million of it to build resistance here in our own region, where we are funding the PNG government and other governments in the Pacific to build up their capability should a case of Ebola come back here. I think it's money well spent, and even though we haven't beaten the disease at present, we're certainly not seeing the exponential incidence of Ebola cases. Some countries in West Africa have managed to quell the outbreak, like Nigeria. They've got much better health systems. So I think the moral of the story is that these countries need to build up their health systems so that they can respond more rapidly to the outbreak of a disease like this, which is caused through all sorts of cultural activities. So I hope that answers your question, but we were very conscious of the need to fund the work directly so there was no waste, no opportunity for corruption.
Okay.
My name is Morgan Paxton and I'm a gardener, farmer in Mount Wilson. You've described this wonderful area as being very productive with beef and vines and tourism, etc. The single biggest threat we have here at the moment is a threat of Gasfield mining occurring right through this region, and we see it as a major threat to those industries. We feel that the only answer is for a much, much bigger push on renewable energies, and we're really concerned that the government does not see that as a priority. So I wonder if you can tell us what exactly the situation is in this case of renewable energy.
We support renewable energy. In fact, it was the Howard government that introduced the first renewable energy target anywhere in the world. That was a Howard government initiative. And so the RET has been in existence since 2001, and we're in the process of reviewing the target of 20%. We believe that the 20% is doable and economically sustainable. Cheap energy has been the basis of Australia's success as a nation. The fact that we've had low cost and plentiful supplies of fossil fuels, coal, is what Australia built its economy on, let's face it. And it made us highly, highly competitive. We're only a country of 23 million people, yet we're the 12th largest economy in the world. So the world has moved on from fossil fuels, and we're seeking ways to increase renewables, and that's what the Productivity Commission report has been about. The government's currently considering that report. In our direct action plan to tackle climate change, we are supporting solar. We're providing a $2.55 billion fund to encourage business and industry to be much more efficient and innovative and creative in its use of energy, and that will include supporting those who are looking for creative outcomes in renewable. You mentioned the mining proposals here. Of course, they'd have to be economically viable, and if there isn't demand for it, then the proponents won't go ahead with them. My view on this, and I come now from a mining state, a mining and resource state in Western Australia, is that you have to get the balance right between sustainable development and jobs, but preserving the very best of what your natural environment has to offer. And of course here in this part of the world, I know that your underground water is a precious resource, so underground aquifers cannot be tampered with, they have to be maintained. So any proposed exploration could not impact on your underground water. That would be completely unacceptable outcome. So without wanting to buy into the politics of it, in terms of the way we look at it in Western Australia, there are many more sustainable ways to generate electricity, generate energy, than one that would impact on the local environment. And I'm hoping that the state government here takes the same view.
To the Honourable Minister, I'm Vic Dawson, a lifetime resident of Robe, and a lot of people are surprised to realise that I'm 92.
I don't believe it.
Well, it's true. Anyway.
I believe he deserves a round of applause. You're the same age as my dad, and I have to say my dad's a little bit frail, so good on you.
I'm a little bit hard of hearing, you know. But anyway, I am a recipient of the age pension, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm satisfied that it has been adjusted to the CPI as compared to the former male basic wage. Now, I think the Prime Minister and the Treasurer have the right outlook in trying to control Australia's debt, reduce that. Now, I would just offer a suggestion. I don't know whether this is practical or not, but has the government thought about increasing the GST there? If it was increased, say, to 12 or 12.5%, you'd get about another 20 or 25%. Now, I think this would be a very equitable way of spreading the tax over the population. And we're paying it now, and most people, I don't think, would probably realise that a little bit of adjustment would perhaps return so much extra revenue for the government. Now, that's just my thoughts. I'm not quite sure whether it's practical. As I remember the legislation, I think it would have been introduced in the time of the Howard government. I thought to change it, there may have to be that all the states had to agree to it. And that whether this would be not practical or not, I don't know. But anyway, thank you. Your thoughts?
Well, Victor, let's take a straw poll here. Hands up if you think it would be a wise idea for the Australian government to increase the GST. Those against?
Only because of the political retribution.
Well, that's an interesting outcome. I must try this in other electorates around Australia.
We're reformists here in Barker, Julie.
Because I know that they often say that in Western Australia we think that paying tax is voluntary. That's a joke.
I say, Julie, I don't know if I did it for Julie's Christmas card, but to all my Western Australian colleagues, I did put a little note down the bottom, thanks for the GST. just rubbing
Well,
it in.
you know how to rub salt in the wound. Look, Victor, you raise a very valid point to this extent. The reason we introduced the consumption tax was because it is more equitable, that you pay tax on what you consume. And there are some unfair taxes in my mind, and sorry to the state government again, but payroll tax is a tax on jobs as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
So that's not equitable in my mind, but I'm not a state member of parliament, so I don't have to justify it. But the challenge we had when we introduced the GST was trying to get the legislation through the Senate, and you might recall that John Howard at the time had to negotiate very hard and long with the Democrats, and so the GST was, and the Greens, the GST was not put on everything across the board. It had a lot of exemptions, and that made it a much more complicated tax. My mind, I think you could do more to simplify the current GST rather than increase the GST on the items it's already applying to. I think that make it completely broad-based across the economy. Now, that's just a personal view. She adds quickly before anybody thinks that they've got a story for the front page. It's just my personal view. We have a tax white paper underway, so the Treasurer is looking at our tax system. We want our taxes to be lower, simpler, fairer. And if that suggestion does come up, if there is a suggestion about changing the GST in any way, two things. It would have to go to an election. You'd have to take it to an election. You wouldn't introduce it without taking it to an election. And secondly, each state and territory must agree. And that was the beauty of the structure of the GST, because it was a state tax. The Commonwealth Government collects it and passes it on to the states to divvy up. And so the legislation requires that if there's any change to the GST, each and every state must be prepared to agree to it.
Minister, thank you for being here. Alongside the public brief of last week at Mountain Place, on the pages there, perhaps have been made best by Paul Kelly, when he said it's dishonest to gloss over the evidence of Islamist influence on the gunman man Warren Norris. We're considering an inquiry which should neither exaggerate the mistakes nor resist reforms to the system we have. Do you think that's the general view Australians have, or is there another?
Paul Kelly is a very good journalist, I would suggest one of the best opinion writers in the country, and he always has a very measured and considered view. There will be a joint inquiry between the New South Wales government and the federal government as to how this occurred. I think all of us just had our hearts in our mouths as we watched that siege unfold. Surely not in Australia, this just can't happen. And then when we learned a little about the background of this guy, I've got to say I was shocked to the core, as was the Prime Minister, as was Premier Mike Baird. And the fact that this guy was known to the police, known to our intelligence agencies, known to the courts, had a long history of violent, aberrant, bizarre behaviour, and yet he was still able to hold people to hostage situation this way, which led to the deaths of 2 people, is truly shocking. Without going into the details of who knew what when, because that will come out through the review, I think what it does show, we need more information sharing across the silos of state and federal government. I don't know what the magistrate who heard the bail application had before him. I don't know what the federal police had before them, and I don't know what ASIO had before it. ASIO is an information gathering organisation. It's not an enforcer, and it's not a racial profiler, for example. ASIO collects the facts and draws conclusions and provides information as necessary to other agencies like the federal police. So we will find out in due course what happened and how it happened. But think of this, even if he were under surveillance, say he were under 24-hour surveillance, which is one of the most expensive items I can imagine for ASIO and the federal police. He went to see his lawyer carrying a sports bag in a coffee shop in the middle of Sydney. Just wandered in, sat down with his barrister. Now, that wouldn't trigger in anyone a response. So even if all this information comes out that somebody should have known more or somebody should have told somebody, unless he were behind bars, and I don't know why he was on bail because I haven't seen the information, and Tony and I are both lawyers, so we're very careful not to pass judgment on that.
Malcolm, being a criminal lawyer, and I'm very much looking forward to the investigation because I want to know that before the court.
We have to manage our expectations that every nutter, every psychopath, every potential killer can be prevented from carrying out their evil intent. And in this case, the guy decided to invoke the cause of terrorism to draw maximum attention to himself. I mean, opposite Channel 7, I don't know whether that was coincidental or deliberate, I don't know, but it certainly captured the attention of the world. And I was in Papua New Guinea at the time with the Defence Minister, the Immigration Minister, the Justice Minister, and the Commissioner of the Federal Police. We were all in Port Moresby. We happened to be on a video link with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet back in Canberra talking about completely different matters. During the course of that Cabinet meeting, the Prime Minister slipped a note and he closed the Cabinet meeting and told the NSC, the National Security Committee ministers, to stay on the line, and he told us what was happening in Martin Place. Our Justice Minister and the Federal Police Commissioner went straight to the airport and got on a plane to go home, and the rest of us just remained in touch with the Prime Minister throughout the day. So it was truly shocking, and I am pleased that there is going to be a detailed inquiry into it. But I'm afraid it highlights that acts of terrorism can take place anywhere, anytime, in any country, which is why we have bolstered our intelligence and security agencies by about $600 million this year.
80-year-old retired farmer. I hope to catch up with Vic and your father, who lived to 92. Provided it's still got the marbles, of course.
He still marches in Anzac Day, parades, yeah,
Right,
so he gets around.
Right. My question, you sort of partly answered. Before I say that, thank you for coming today. Could you please tell me why the Prime Minister and some of his colleagues want to dismantle the REP scheme when there is approximately $9 billion of private capital wanting and waiting to invest in the renewable energy industry? The potential investment is dependent on the RET being maintained. A few facts. Tony Abbott promised not to touch the RET before the election. Tony Abbott claims to be the Prime Minister for Infrastructure, and this is massive infrastructure. SA now generates 40% of its energy from renewables. Could go on about California, a state of 38 million people who have legislated for 30%, and they're thinking of raising it to 50%. The state of Texas, which has a population of 26.5 million people, has now got more and 3 times more installed wind power than we have in the whole of Australia. Dick Warburton was commissioned to inquire into the RET. This cost hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayers' dollars in consultancy fees. They concluded that the RET actually pushed electricity prices down, not up. The renewable energy industry is generating clean energy, jobs, investment and cheaper power. Can I ask you, with your considerable influence, to persuade the Abbott government to keep its election promise and maintain the RET scheme, not just at 20%, but at the 41,000 gigawatt hours by 2020?
Thank you, I have to say, please allow me to be blunt, it's based on a false assumption. The Abbott government isn't getting rid of the RET scheme. As I said, we outside of politics, introduced it in 2001. It was our idea. We got Dick Warburton to look at it, and you've read out the... Yeah.
It's a required review.
Exactly, yeah. Dick Warburton, under the legislation, was required, well, he wasn't, but we were required to review it. So the review wasn't an Abbott government initiative, it was a legislative requirement that it be reviewed, and so he carried that out. And we're considering the detail of that review. About 2 weeks ago, I represented the government at a climate change conference in Lima, in Peru, and I made a number of speeches, including referring to the RET and our commitment to it. And they were all speeches signed off by the Prime Minister's office. So we are working through the review. We're going to try and find a position that is economically viable, that takes into account the facts. I think that Australia will meet its emissions reduction target of a 20% reduction by 5% reduction by 2020 over 2000 levels. Yeah, get it right. And that will come down to the energy mix that we use. We are required to commit to emissions reductions post 2020. And again, we'll take into account the best energy mix that our country can handle economically. Now, RET and the whole issue of renewable energy is an opportunity for innovation, for creative thinking, for Australians to do what we do best, and that's usually come up with a technological or innovative solution. And while obviously coal will continue to be the backbone of energy in this country for a while I believe we should be considering all sorts of energy types. I mean, I'm not ideologically opposed to considering nuclear power, because it is a zero emissions, 24/7 base load power source, and countries like France get 80% of their power from nuclear. Now, people are shaking their heads, fine, but we all look at France as clean, green France, and of course it is. They've got 80% of their power comes from nuclear. Australia, we have so many other sources and ways of generating electricity, and the RET is part of that. It's not right to say the Prime Minister's against it. He's not. He's working through the Warburton report, and will have what I think will be a credible position announced in the new year.
Julie, before we go on to further questions, can I just acknowledge the presence of His Worship the Mayor Peter Risley. Thank you, Peter, for coming along. And it's just arrived. So thank you very much. We've had lumps of your silver colleagues at events over the...
Welcome to Robe, Minister. My name is Alistair Douglas. I'm a resident of Robe, and the last 12 years I've spent involved in development aid up in the Philippines. I was working for AusAid and LACLI, with a not-for-profit non-government foundation in Mindanao. which has been...
That's had its challenges.
There's lots of challenges in there. It was reported in the press that there was to be a 3.7 billion cut in foreign aid. I'm just wondering how this was liable to affect our region directly, and more specifically, the nature and scope of programs planned for the Philippines in the future. Thank you.
We are in the process of going through country by country, region by region. But I have refocused the aid budget on our region, the Indian Ocean, Asia Pacific. As I said before, it's where we can make the biggest difference. It's where we can have the most control over how our aid dollar is spent, to ensure there isn't the inefficiency and the waste and the duplication and the mixed priorities that we've seen in the past. And of course, any diminution in an aid budget is hard to take, but I've called on the Labor Party to pass the savings that they themselves identified in the budget at the last election. There's $5 billion worth of savings that Labor said were necessary, and they're now refusing to pass them. So I keep hoping that they will pass those savings so that we don't have to go down these paths of looking for savings elsewhere. But in the meantime, we'll be working country by country to see how we can deliver still a very effective aid budget. And I have to point out that the whole purpose of aid is to lift a country's standard of living so that that country can become more self-sustaining, more resilient, have its own economy, own opportunities to create jobs and the like. And so the changing nature of our region means that the aid profile changes considerably. We no longer provide aid to China, for example, whereas we did, because China's opened its own economy. It's now the second or largest economy in the world. We used to give a lot of aid to China, we don't now. Likewise, South Korea, we gave South Korea a lot of aid. We don't anymore because South Korea has developed its own economy and resilience. Likewise, India. So we don't provide aid to India anymore, but we do invest in some of their water projects and the like. And that's not to say that poverty is eradicated in these countries or anything like that. It's just that they now have the capacity to use their own budgets to reduce poverty and lift standards of living in those countries. So somewhere like the Philippines, over time the aid profile will change as the Philippine economy grows and it has more opportunities.
I'm Richard White from Robe. You touched on Middle Eastern matters. In a recent interview, a former Australian soldier and a former advisor to General Petraeus in Iraq, David Kilcullen, portrayed the scenario that potentially Al-Qaeda and Islamic State would join forces geographically on either side of Iran. You end up with this massive holy war between the Shia and the Sunni, and potentially using nuclear weapons. Would you like to comment on that sort of horrendous scenario?
Well, David Kilcullen is a very wise advisor, and General Petraeus, I must say, is someone whom I have turned to on occasions for advice. In fact, I rang him the other day when the whole issue of whether Australia should go back into Iraq to support the Iraqi government to build its defence forces. So I actually rang David Petraeus and sought his advice because he knows the area and the scenarios so very well. Look, there are a number of horrific scenarios that could play out, and the Sunni-Shia conflict spreading beyond Syria and Iraq and Libya is obviously one of those. Yes, you could play out a scenario where Iran became wedged between a number of the competing terrorist organisations, but that's playing out in Pakistan. Pakistan is also a nuclear state. So we have these hotspots around the world. All I can say is the United States has more than its agenda full of areas where it needs to use its influence and its military might to assist in trying to preserve peace and stability in the world. I am deeply concerned that there is no military solution to the rise of terrorism. It's a question of trying to put up an alternative narrative to their hateful, barbaric ideology. It's a question of educating people. But it's going to be a long haul, and for those who are determined to inflict harm on others, Prime Minister's adopted the phrase the death cult when he's talking about ISIL. I can't think of a more apt description, because we've not seen such barbarity or inhumane behaviour from even a terrorist organisation. Interestingly, ISIL was too barbaric even for Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda distanced itself from ISIL because of the mass executions, the crucifixions, the rape and torture and the beheadings that ISIL has conducted using social media. So that is an appalling scenario. It's one I'm not going to rule out, but it's sadly only one of a number that could well occur. And all we can do in Australia is use every effort to keep our people here safe, and that includes trying to stop Australians going and taking part in the conflict.
Minister James Yates from Robe. There's been a lot of hot air blown in South Australia about submarines, and former Minister David Johnson said something about canoes, which a lot of us agreed with. What he did say a while back, and I quote him, submarines are the government's most important technical and strategic military assets. I totally disagree with that. And I know it's difficult for you to answer here with media present, but I just ask you, please.
What's the media here?
Well, if they aren't, they will be. But seriously, Minister, we can't afford these submarines. We don't need them. They're old hat. China's building stacks of them, and we, as you well know, we have the ANZUS alliance. And floating around us, and floating around New Zealand and everywhere, there's a huge lot of American, not in hundreds, but American nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed deterrent submarines. Let them do it through the ANZUS alliance for us, and build surface ships or something like that. And I ask you, even at this late hour, it seems it's been such a political nonsense in South Australia that the federal government should review whether we have submarines at all. Just maintain the Collins fleet until it's finished and don't build any more.
Your question assumes that the United States will always be there in the numbers and level of strength that is required to protect not only Australia but every other country in the Asia Pacific. And I don't believe you can make that assumption. The United States is our closest strategic partner. And it's because of the presence of the United States in the Pacific since the Second World War that we've had relative peace and stability in the Pacific. But you cannot take that for granted into the future. And the United States have made it quite plain to a number of countries that they expect countries to pull their weight when it comes to their own protection and their own self-preservation. So whilst the US is the bedrock of our security arrangements in this country, we cannot expect them to do the heavy lifting for us all the time, and they are under budget pressures. They are thinly stretched across the world. We were just talking about the requirements of the US in the Middle East. They're expected to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. They're expected to solve the Syria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, you go on. That's what the US is expected to do, as well as look after Australia. Well, you know, we're, as I said, the 12th largest economy in the world. We're the 5th largest on a per capita basis. Australia needs to look to its own resources as well as rely on the United States. In terms of the best resources, military resources, we are an island continent. I know that the question of the best military assets has been considered by experts far superior in their knowledge to me. In fact, I defer to Senator Fawcett here today, who knows a lot about this subject. But the point that Senator Johnson was making is that we've got to get value for money. For whatever it is that we acquire, we've got to get value for money. And no decision has been taken on the subs, but I do know that whatever sort of marine naval equipment is purchased or built, it will need maintenance, and that will carry on in South Australia, so there will continue to be jobs in the defence industry in South Australia.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd love to be here all day. but unfortunately there are other colleagues of mine who demand Julie's time. What we've got time for is one last question.
This is just something that happens to me on a number of occasions because I have 2 children in school, and I always want to ask this question. At the beginning of every ceremonial event at school, we listen to the acknowledgement of the Indigenous people. I have no problem with that. I think it's great that we do that because that inclusive kind of thing should happen. But what I'm always left with is that my children are 8th generation Australians. And at the end of that speech, I can't see how they are allowed or can feel connected to the land as the Aborigines are. This, to me, ends up in this place where we have disenfranchised people who are Australians, who are looking for a purpose and looking for something to belong to, but end up going to these countries and fighting someone else's cause. So I want to bring it back to what happens every day. Is it possible that during that acknowledgement, that we can also acknowledge the sacrifices and the struggles and the lives and the deaths and the wars that have been fought by all Australians for 200 years plus, and that we can all connect to Australia and our land and all feel that, and that maybe that'll bring the unity that we really need.
I think that's I think that's a very appropriate sentiment, and I think that's what Australia Day is all about, an acknowledgement of who we are, where we've come from, where we're going. And I hadn't thought about it in the context of the Welcome to Country, which happens every morning in Parliament House as well. But that's a very good point. I guess I'm a 5th generation Adelaide Hills person, and I look back at some of the struggles that our family have been through, mainly through bushfires, but you go back a couple of 100 years and it's been quite an extraordinary story. Australia's history, as ancient as the land, but also its post-European history has been one of extraordinary commitment, struggle, entrepreneurialism, and enterprise. And I think you make a very good point, and it's something that I'm going to get your local member to perhaps give a 5-minute adjournment speech about and see if we can get some support for that kind of acknowledgement. But I think that's exactly what Australia Day is all about, and has managed to bridge that divide between the first Australians and those who have come after. And we are one of the most successful immigrant nations on earth, and we should be proud of that.
Yes.
It falls to me to thank you very much for coming today. We're not rushing away. We've got 10 or so minutes if people want to speak. Met Julie personally quickly, and some people might want some photographs. Obviously Julie, not with me. Because I should say protocol, alcohol, cholesterol and selfies. And selfies.